Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Be me, wagey with a terrible job. Have to wake up the next day at 6 a.m. In bed at around 11 p.m., exhausted, but I can't sleep. Play around on the phone for a while. Around 1 a.m. now, say screw it. I am just going to lay still in a position with my eyes closed until I force myself to go to sleep, or I will rage in the morning. Even though I still feel restless and my mind can't shut off, my eyes are really heavy. First time I've ever felt like this. Despite wanting to move, I don't. Eventually start hearing voices, just random shit. At first it startled me, but I was so tired, I just started to ignore it. Voices saying my name, random numbers, random sentences that didn't really make sense, don't care. Shut the hell up. I want to go to sleep. All of a sudden, sharp rings in both my ears, like Modern Warfare 2 flashbang. I shoot up out of my bed. It's really hard to move, like when your leg falls asleep but all over my body. Edges of my vision are jagged with black, convinced I am literally dying and need to get help. I feel 100% awake. This is reality. My feet feel the wood of the floor. I see myself in my bedroom mirror opposite of my bed. Make my way to my bedroom door to tell my roommate to call 911 or to help me or some shit. Grasp the doorknob. I have to use the full force of my body to open the door. Doing this, I lost balance and fell into my closet. I'm on the floor. Can't get back up. I say, screw it. I'm dead. I was 99% sure I was awake, but out of a type of desperation. Hey, maybe this isn't it. I clawed on the floor to grasp it. Realize it has the texture of my blanket. Wake up back in my bed. Tweak out and tell my roommate about what happened. Said he heard some type of crash in my room minutes before. Most/X/ thing that happened to me, I guess.
I once fell asleep unexpectedly at like 4 in the afternoon while on a voice call with some friends and woke up bad. Basically went from lying down talking and realizing I was a little sleepy to suddenly finding myself crouching upright in my bed. Every muscle tense, trying to suck down air through a throat that felt like it was sealed shut with concrete. I flailed so hard I put a huge hole in the drywall above my bed. Hate that kind of shit.
By when your leg falls asleep, do you mean including the electrical shock feeling too? Because that same shit happens to me every once in a while. You're the only other person I've seen describing the same shit. Usually it'll happen during an episode of sleep paralysis, but sometimes it happens just like it did with you, where my mind just won't shut off, but my body falls asleep anyways.
My English is shit, but whatever. Mom told me this story last year and now I have the chance to get it out of my chest, so here we go. Be us. Mexicans living in the frontier, on the Mexican side of course, have a huge family on Mom's side. Like every Latino out there. Over the course of less than a year, half of the family die from health-related issues and accidents. Only 3 siblings remain. Mom, 2 aunts, and 1 uncle. The funeral house literally has us on quick call at that point. Shit is hard, but we keep going. It is what it is. 3 years have passed and 1 aunt is out too, so now it is Mom and a couple of siblings. Cousins and more or less close relatives dreamed about them at some point when their deaths were relatively recent. Mom never believes or dreams of ghosts or other spooky things, so she calls it BS and carries on. Fast forward a year after. Halloween and El Día de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, are literally one day after the other on the calendar. Picture it like that Disney movie Coco. It can get like that in the southern parts of the country. Here in the north, we are more autistic about old traditions than our beloved southern, so we tend to do more Halloween than the original thing. Uncle says screw it, and makes us do an altar to the memory of the dead in old grandma's house, and his new house. Never did one before or after that one, so it was kind of fun to put the things they loved in life as well as their favorite food. A ton of alcohol for the uncles, cigs for the grandpa, sweets for grandma, and this homemade guava candy that one great uncle loved. We stayed the night in my old grandma's house in different rooms since the house had enough beds for everyone. The only light in the house is from the candles on the altar, and the digital clocks in each room. Mom has this quirk that she goes to bed and just lays for an hour or three, eyes closed and all, and then goes to sleep. If something gets her up from the bed, then shit restarts and she gets understandably mad about it. 40 minutes passed and she could hear someone opening the door of the room. Dad was snoring like a champ, and I was pretty much in the same spot on the next door. She hears and feels someone walking on the floor as well as the sound of a plastic bag creaking with each step. Then it stops once he reaches my mom's side of the bed, just in front of her. Mom was panicking since everyone was sleeping, on bed at that time. She kept her eyes closed, thinking a thief just got into the house and was looking for some money or jewels. Suddenly she felt how that person leaned forward and gave her a kiss on her forehead for a second, the sound of the plastic bag filling the space between the two. As soon as that happens, the other person leaves the room the same way he came in and closed the door behind him. Mom jumps out of the bed and opens the door of the room to see who the hell did that. She's alone in the dark just outside the room, the only light coming from the candles on the altar at the end of the hallway. She went back to bed and realized that the room smelled slightly like guava candy and cigs. She started to tear up a little bit in silence until she got to sleep a couple hours after. My feels when I realized who was the person who gave her that kiss. My great-uncle was a good fella, a party animal that loved his beer, dancing and eating this homemade guava candy when he was having a blast, even at an older age. He died from a crash accident some states out while working, and moving his body to our city was problematic at that time because of the plague, making dress him rather hard since the body was following its natural course. So 3/4 of his body was covered in a thick black plastic bag when it was time to see him on the closed coffin. Shit gets weird when holidays older than the own country gets involved.
I don't know what it is about small towns that cause a shitload of happenings, but I have a few. I work at a hotel in a tiny-ass town in Kentucky, and I'll just tell a few of my more memorable tales. Middle of the day, waiting at the front desk. Boss told me the PC in the lobby had a few games on it, just shit like Bejeweled and Solitaire. Told me not to turn up the volume, though. I'm playing Bejeweled for the 836th time that day when I get bored of sitting in complete silence besides the clicks and clacks of the older than dust mouse. Turn up the volume just a bit. I figured the boss wouldn't mind because there wasn't a single person in the lobby. Everything's chill for a few minutes. Display freezes. Does this shit regularly? Turn off the monitor and go to turn it back on. Screen is on the desktop, but the speakers are blaring a really high-pitched sound. Head is pounding and hurting. Nose starts bleeding. Dive under the desk and rip the power cord out of the back of the PC. Sound stops. Pain stops. Hear a bunch of footsteps from upstairs from guests, wondering what that sound was. No one came to the front desk. The boss arrives a few hours later, notices the small bloodstains on my shirt. Immediately starts chewing my ass out for turning up the volume on the PC. Ask him why the hell it even happens in the first place. He has no idea, but tells me the guy who brought it in the first place was a weirdo that was really into voodoo and Satanism and other occult crap. Boss is superstitious about everything, but I'm honestly suspecting some voodoo shit at this point. I'll type up and share some more tales in a second. Some prick has been breaking into some of the empty rooms, stuffing rubber gloves down the drains, messing up beds, cutting up carpets for some reason. The boss has me routinely checking the rooms, making sure they're locked, and so are their windows. I just finished a bunch of rooms on the first floor. The motel has 3 floors. Stopped to get a quick drink from a water fountain in the hall. Just across from the room I just checked. Hear the door behind me rattling a little. Didn't startle me. Usually the hallways were quite noisy because the walls were pretty thin. I immediately rushed in and checked out what the hell was going on, for a brief second as the light from the hall was shining into the room. Swear on my life, I see the silhouette of something hanging from a rope. People have self-ended in this motel before. Thankfully, all of the cases happened before I showed up. Shit myself for a split second. Blink and the entire room is now messed up, exactly like the way I mentioned before. Tip off the janitor, rush to the boss's office. Gives me a, what can you do look? Yeah, I've heard from the staff about that before. Rooms never got fucked up after the hanging woman appeared, though. The rest of the rooms were completely fine for the next 3 months. It's the afternoon, on my lunch break, eating a cheesy meatball sub while doing data entry crap. I'm just eating at the front desk in the lobby because my boss doesn't care, and neither does anyone who's gonna spend a night here. Notice someone dash into the employees' only room while I'm eating. Shrug it off as one of the janitors. There's 2 and one of them is a shifty dude who's really quick take another bite of my meatball sub. Something hits me really hard in the back. Start choking, panic, and get out of my seat. Bang on the door to the employees' only room while trying to dislodge the melted cheese and meatball stuck in my throat. Get shoved over by something. Spontaneously throw up. No longer choking. I'm terrified and panicked, crying a little as I crawl backwards and end up with my back against the front desk. The shifty janitor comes darting around the corner, sees me panicked and crying and my shirt covered in vomit. Face turns white as a sheet, darts away. As soon as I told my boss about this shit, he let me have the week off, paid too. Flat out told me he wasn't allowed to talk about it when I asked him what the hell happened that day. MFW.
I have a secondhand story. One of my professors shared it with the class. He's a molecular biologist from Spain, so very skeptical of ghosts. But he said when was a kid he and his father stayed at a house that was kind of haunted. It's not that spooky, but it's a cute story. The gist is this. The professor's dad was in university at the time, studying to become an architect. They're renting a cheap room from this old lady who lives alone. The bed has a single bed which the professor and his dad have to share. On the first night, the old lady warns the professor's dad to place the mattress on the floor because she's worried about my professor, who was only a wee lad at the time, falling off the bed. The professor's dad just thinks the old lady's being overprotective and tells her it will be fine. That night, the 2 of them woke up to the bed shaking violently. They're used to earthquakes and assume that's what it is, but then they realize it's the bed. They jump out of bed and it immediately stops shaking. The professor's dad decides to pull the mattress onto the floor like the old lady said, and the 2 of them never experience anything bizarre like that again. Various things like this happen over a long period of time. Odd little things. I'll just share one more. When the woman is going to visit Hawaii one day, she tells the professor's dad to not have any guests and not to ever turn the music on too loud, which the professor's dad promptly ignores by having a BBQ and inviting a friend of his. They're listening to the stereo loudly when it just shuts off for no reason. It's plugged in and the electricity is working. They're like, what the hell is wrong with this piece of junk? Then they see that the volume has just been turned all the way down. Anytime they turn the music back up, the same thing happens, very quickly, making it seem like the stereo shut off. They decide to just leave the music off. So anyway, after a ton of stuff like this, the professor's dad finds a blueprint one day. Remember, he's working to become an architect, so he's actually working on a blueprint himself for a project, but somehow it gets lost and he winds up looking all over the house for it. He ends up looking in this coat closet where he sees a ton of suits, and there, rolled up, is a blueprint. He pulls it out and it's not his blueprint. But he decides at this point, screw it, I'm going to use this for my project. The old woman comes out as he's working and says, "Did I hear you rummaging around in that closet?" And the professor's dad says, "Yes, I was looking for my blueprint and I found this." She says, "My husband was an architect and that's the blueprint for this house. He built it for me. He died 15 years ago." So by this point, a ton of minor shit has happened. From hearing footsteps in the hall, to hearing voices, to his son, my professor, claiming multiple times to have seen a man in his room, so he puts 2 and 2 together. Oh shit. I wonder if the old man's ghost is watching over this house. So later, the professor's dad is visiting his brother, who is a Catholic priest, and he mentions how he used to have to cleanse houses back in Spain, but he only ever did it under the guidance of someone with more experience. The professor's dad gets the idea, "Hey, you should try to cleanse this house I'm renting a room in. There might be an old man's spirit in there." The old lady is in Hawaii again, so she isn't there to protest. So the brother priest comes over and cleanses the house, performing the ritual as best as he can recall. The messed up thing is that just before this, The professor's dad had found a new place to rent, and he was supposed to be moving out. And his move-out date coincided with the return of the old lady's trip from Hawaii. And as soon as she pulled up to the house, she sensed something was wrong. She stood there staring at the house, looking confused. She glanced at the professor's dad kinda strangely and then went inside. By this point, the professor and his dad have packed all their shit into their car, and they're preparing to leave. The professor's dad is about to head inside to say goodbye to the old woman one last time and thank her for her hospitality, but then they both hear her screaming from inside the house. "No! What have you done? What have you done?" Both of them get spooked, and then they hear the old lady scream, "He's gone! He's gone!" The professor's dad thinks oops, and the two of them hop back into the car and drive away, never to revisit that house or see the old lady again. That's all.
So I recall a story from a few years back when I would spend summers with my grandma, guessing because my parents didn't want much to do with me. Anyway, my grandma wasn't the most stable person. She wasn't crazy, but she had a different house every time I would go visit. I didn't think much of it as a child. It was always a new location to spend summer. On the last summer trip to her house, she lived in a fairly older neighborhood. The houses were very dated, with large spaces in between them, and only 1/3 of the houses actually had someone in them. I remember what started the problems now. There was a pretty large forest behind the house. It could have been 5 trees. I was a kid, who knows. And I would go out into those trees every day and go adventuring like my favorite video game and cartoon heroes. During one of my adventures, I heard my grandma scream, a nasty scream like she was injured. I ran back to the house to check on her. It took me a good 20 minutes. I'm not sure how I heard the scream or if it was hers. My grandma never drank anything, but a drunken psychotic is the only way I can describe how she was acting. She was on the kitchen floor, having fallen off a stepladder, and one of her legs was clearly broken. I called the police, but what scared me was how she was acting, kind of flailing around muttering, "I can't run away, the Lungrow can find me, I can't run away, the Lungrow can find me." After she had been taken to the ER, I stayed there with her. It was a small town. They knew my grandma, though she hadn't been there long, and having known her, knew me and let me stay in there with her. I remember getting a pizza that night. She was coherent now. And I remember asking her, "Grandma, what's a Lungrow?" She choked on her pizza, spit it out, and smiled at me. She went into a story of how when she was a kid, her and her neighbor friends used to tease this older disabled gentleman by the name of Henry Lungrow, and it turned into a story for them that the Lungrow, as they called him, would kill and eat any children that ever spoke to him. About a week afterwards, we got to return home. Grandma stayed in the house cooking a large meal, and I went back out into the woods to play some more, but I wasn't alone. There was a guy there who looked as though he had Down syndrome, and having known 1 or 2 people with it in my class at school, I knew it wasn't particularly a threat. I said hello and skirted around because I was still uneasy with the idea of someone else in my forest. The neighborhood had plenty of houses that were occupied. There was no way I was the only one to brave these woods. Having played a while, I thought it was time to return home. The food was still cooking, but I couldn't find my grandma anywhere. I checked the kitchen and main living room, the cellar, but I couldn't find her anywhere. I was scared. I called the police again, and they came over and searched the house. I hadn't looked in her upstairs bedroom. I don't know why I didn't. It just didn't occur to me. After doing the search upstairs, the police officer, the same guy who helped when my grandma broke her leg, just came down and said, "You need to come with me. Do you know your parents' number?" I didn't, but it was by the phone they were called. My mom and dad came out to pick me up and spent a lot of time with the police. I was again playing in the backyard, but not the forest, and I saw that same guy just staring at me. It unnerved me more than I can say, and I went back inside, not telling anyone. We stayed for another week or so, and then had a funeral for Grandma. I hadn't known she had died, and it hit me hard. No one bothered to tell me. The casket was closed. It was a quiet, quick funeral. My parents said their goodbyes to family members, and we went back home. As I've grown, I understand the horror my grandma must have felt, because that guy who I saw in the forest has been following me. He looks different every time, but I know it's him. Something in the vibe I get from him. I don't know if my grandma's childhood stories were true. I don't know how she died, and I don't know if I'm overreacting. But what I do know is that I feel like running, hiding, and moving so he can't find me. That guy. The Lungrow.
It was summer, and I was on a field trip with my town's community center's daycare program. We were at the New York State Museum Inn. I was in a group with maybe 2 or 3 other kids and one of the daycare workers for a chaperone. We got there in the morning, and were told we could roam around the museum with our group until either 12 or 1, when we had to meet back up with everyone for lunch on the 3rd floor. Our group walked around, looking at all the exhibits, and after a while, we realized we had lost track of time. We only had a few minutes to get up to the 3rd floor for lunch and attendance, and we were on the other side of the museum from where the elevators are. We hurried quickly to the lobby and hopped into an elevator. Out of breath from the near sprint we had done to the lobby, our group piled into the elevator. We hit the 3RD floor button, and my chaperone said we had made it in time, and that we still had a minute or so to spare. Then, as the doors were closing, an extremely well-dressed man walked into the elevator. He was wearing black shoes, a black suit with a white dress shirt, black tie, black leather gloves, and a black fedora, and was carrying a black leather briefcase. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but I've always looked back at this and thought this was very odd, as it was summer, and he was dressed for the dead of winter. As the man got on, I noticed that he kept his head down, almost as though he didn't want us to see his face. He quickly turned around, only then lifting his head. He just stood there with his back to us, and I don't remember ever seeing him select a floor. The elevator doors closed, and this eerie feeling seemed to be emanating from the man in black. We had left the lobby on the 1st floor and were going up the 3rd floor, so the ride should have been maybe 10 or 20 seconds at most. The elevator's display showed we had arrived at the 3rd floor, but the elevator didn't stop. The numbers just kept climbing, and we were definitely still moving. I want to preface this by saying those elevators in the lobby only have access to 4 floors, and to my knowledge, the museum only has 4 above-ground floors. I'll talk more about that at the end. At this point, it had been well over a minute since the elevator started moving, and the numbers on the display continued to climb, as did the elevator. That eerie feeling that had been seemingly emanating from this man was getting more intense, and the air in the elevator was beginning to get extremely heavy. This seemed to get more and more noticeable as we continued to go up. The higher the elevator climbed, the feeling turned from eerie to foreboding. I remember getting the feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you know something bad is going to happen. Something definitely wasn't right. The display was saying we had passed the 50th floor and we were still climbing. At this point, it had been around 5 minutes in the elevator. The atmosphere in the elevator had gotten almost unbearable. This heavy, ominous feeling was something I've never experienced since. The closest thing I can compare it to is that feeling you get when you walk down a dark hallway after watching a horror movie, and even that doesn't begin to describe this. Suddenly, the elevator stops. There's a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the elevator. It went from this foreboding feeling to a feeling of impending doom. Then I remember almost panicking when I thought about what was on the other side of those doors. I was telling myself over and over again that the buttons on the elevator don't go past the 4th floor, so there aren't any floors beyond that. So whatever is on the other side of those doors can't possibly exist. This whole experience can't possibly have happened, and when the doors open, I'll see all my friends from the other groups eating lunch, and everything will be okay. But that's not what happened, and this is where things have always gotten fuzzy for me. I remember getting on the elevator with my group, the man walking in, and the elevator going up, but I can't remember my group being in the elevator after a certain point. I know it was at least 5 minutes from the time we entered the elevator before it stopped, and yet I can't tell you how much time passed between when the elevator stopped and when the doors opened. I can remember looking at the display to see what floor we were on, but can't remember what it said. I remember being frozen there, with no sound or movement whatsoever. I remember feeling like if those doors opened, something bad was going to happen, to the point where I remember panicking inside my head, pretending that none of this wasn't happening. But every time I opened my eyes, that sinister man was still standing there, as still as a statue. And then all of a sudden, The man who was responsible for all of this, who had not moved a single muscle since the elevator doors closed, drops his briefcase. Not even a second after the briefcase hit the ground, the doors of the elevator opened. And yet I can't remember what was beyond those doors. I have tried to remember it and have never been able to see it. I just remember it being white and bright. The man then calmly picked up his briefcase, tipped his fedora, almost as if to bid us goodbye, and walked off the elevator. I then remember the doors closing and that ominous feeling is gone, and in an instant we were on the 3rd floor and the doors popped open. Only then do I remember seeing the rest of my group on the elevator. All of them looked as terrified as I did, especially our chaperone. Looking out, I saw the rest of the kids and chaperones from the other groups. We walked out of the elevator and had been expecting to be extremely late for lunch, but we had made it on time. This is impossible, because we had initially made it to the elevator a minute or so before lunch started, and that encounter on the elevator had lasted at least 5 or 10 minutes. I remember our chaperone pulling the other adults aside, and I assume told them what had happened to us on that elevator. I remember sitting at the table with my friends eating a pizza Lunchable, and the kids from my group, and I sharing the story of what had just happened, no one believing us. I remember the chaperone I had avoided the subject for the rest of the day, and the other kids in my group seemed to have dropped it as well. I remember that I told my mom what had happened, and I've always felt as though she didn't believe me. But before writing this, I wanted to make sure that really did happen since I was so young, and it had been well over a decade since this happened, and that it wasn't something my mind made up over the years, or maybe just a very vivid dream. So I asked my mom if she remembered me telling her about this, and she said she did. She remembers picking me up from the community center, and the second we got into the car, I had told her all about the man in black, and the elevator going up all these floors, and even that he had dropped his briefcase. She said she also remembers me telling her that he had said something to me, though she doesn't remember what, and I don't have any memory of him saying anything. All these years later, I still have absolutely no clue who that man was, where the elevator took us, what was beyond the doors where the man walked off, or anything that happened in that elevator. I just know that it happened. I have no idea how long we were in that elevator. It could have been minutes or even hours, but what I do know is that time seems to have been separate from our reality, since no time had actually passed when we got to the 3rd floor. Hopefully you have heard something similar, or at least have an idea of what happened. I've gone through every explanation I can think of, and none of them make sense. From not remembering correctly what elevator we got on, and perhaps getting in one somewhere else, but that's impossible for reasons I've listed in the paragraph above. I thought maybe it was a really vivid dream, but my mom remembers me telling her right after picking me up from daycare, the day of the field trip. I've even considered a gas leak in the elevator causing us to hallucinate. The one thought that's always been in the back of my mind has been that we got onto the elevator and took a ride through another dimension.
In 2019, I saw a UFO floating over the rough area of the GM factory in Oshawa, Ontario, Canada. It was night, but I could see the rough shape of the craft as well as lights on the craft. They weren't like lights I've ever seen on an aircraft. They looked newer, if that makes sense. There were no flashing beacon lights, which is illegal according to FAA regulations regarding flying at night. The craft just hovered in the same spot for probably an hour, and I didn't see it depart, unfortunately, which could have definitively proven whether this was a conventional aircraft or not. I went out on my balcony and saw the craft at least twice in the exact same spot. It wasn't moving at all, and I didn't hear any noise despite it being pretty close to me. Here's where the story gets really fucked. Within a day or two of this happening, I was walking around the Lake Ontario beach in Oshawa at around 3 a.m. As I'm leaving the beach area, I pass through a parking lot. Some sort of van pulls up and parks right in front of me, in between me and the exit of the parking lot going to the street. For lack of a better description, the two occupants of the van were straight-up alien-looking motherfuckers. My first thought was that they looked old, but not in a conventional sense. I laughed right at their faces 3 feet away from the driver's side window because I assumed it was some sort of joke being played on me by teenagers or something. I walked home, and when I reached the outside of my apartment, I was approached by two people claiming to be cops at first. They then told me that they were men in black, not joking whatsoever, and they proceeded to beat the living fuck out of me and stomp my head into the pavement. They flashed some sort of white light into my eyes, and I genuinely have no idea what the fuck that was about. They took my bank card and ended up getting thousands of dollars out of ATMs or something using fake checks in my bank card.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.